came for me at 4:40 in the morning. I remember the time because the clock on the microwave was the only thing lit in the kitchen, and I'd been standing there in my undershirt trying to decide whether to make coffee or go back to bed. 63 years old, and I still couldn't sleep past 4 most mornings. The boy had taught me that when he was a baby with colic, you wake up at 4 for 10 years straight. Your body never lets you stop. The knock wasn't a knock. It was a fist on wood. 3 times, hard enough to rattle the storm door. I knew before I opened it. You spend enough years dreading something, you can feel it walking up your porch steps. There were 2 deputies and a woman in a navy blazer with a clipboard. Behind them, parked at the curb with the engine running, was a black Lexus I didn't recognize. The passenger door opened and my daughter stepped out. I hadn't seen her in 11 years. She'd cut her hair short. She was wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my truck. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, into the house, like she was already inventorying what was inside. "Sir," the older deputy said, "we have a court order. We need you to step outside." I asked what for. I knew what for, but I asked. The woman with the clipboard held out a folder. "We're here for the children. We have reason to believe they've been held without parental consent." Held. That was the word she used. Like I kept them in a basement. I want to tell you about those kids before I tell you the rest. Because if you don't understand who those kids were to me, none of the rest of it will make sense. 11 years before that morning, my daughter pulled into my driveway in a borrowed Civic with the 3 of them buckled in the back. The oldest was 6, the middle one was 4. The baby was 22 months old, still in diapers, sucking on the corner of a stuffed rabbit so worn the ears were just gray threads. My daughter got out, didn't even shut the car door, and walked up to me with a duffel bag in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. "I need you to take them for a couple of weeks," she said. "Just till I figure things out." I asked her what things. She said she'd call me. She handed me the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, a photocopy of her driver's license, and a piece of notebook paper that said, "I authorize my father to make medical and educational decisions for my children until further notice." She'd signed it, dated it. She'd done at least that much. Then she got back into Civic and drove away. She didn't kiss them. She didn't tell them she loved them. The baby cried for 40 minutes on my couch, holding that rabbit. The middle one didn't say a word for 3 days. The oldest, my grandson, the 6-year-old, he was the one who looked up at me from the kitchen table that first night and said, "Grandpa, is Mom coming back?" I told him I didn't know. I should have lied, but I've been lying about her for 15 years already. To myself, to my late wife when she was dying and asking where her daughter was, to anyone who'd ask how my girl was doing. I was tired of lying, so I told the 6-year-old the truth, and he nodded like he'd already known, and he ate his macaroni. She didn't come back in 2 weeks. She didn't come back in 2 months. The note she'd signed, that little scrap of notebook paper that became the most important piece of paper in my life. I made copies. I had one laminated. I kept the original in a safe deposit box at the credit union on Route 9, in a metal drawer that cost me $48 a year. I kept a lot of things in that box. You'll see why. I'm not going to pretend the next 11 years were easy. I was 52 when she dropped them off. I had a knee that needed surgery I kept putting off. I was working at the parts counter at a Ford dealership, $12 and change an hour. My wife had been gone 3 years. I'd been planning to sell the house and move down to a 1-bedroom in Wilmington to be near my brother. Instead, I painted the upstairs rooms, bought 3 sets of bunk beds from a Goodwill in Roanoke, and learned to braid hair off a YouTube video because my middle granddaughter wouldn't let anybody else touch her head. I picked up a second job stocking shelves at a hardware store. I drove an hour each way. I missed every single one of my own doctor's appointments for about 4 years. I cashed in a savings bond my father had left me. I sold my wife's wedding ring, and I'm not going to talk about that part because I still can't. But those kids ate. They had clothes. They had teeth cleanings. The oldest played JV baseball. The middle one wanted ballet, so she got ballet on a sliding scale scholarship at a studio in town where Miss Ruthann let me pay what I could and pretended she didn't notice when I slipped her a 20 extra at Christmas. The baby, the youngest, she grew up calling me Daddy until I sat her down at 8 years old and explained with a photograph who her real mother was. She looked at the picture for a long time. Then she handed it back and said, "Okay, can I still call you Daddy?" And I said, "Yes, of course, baby, of course you can." I want you to hold on to that. Because what comes next? I want you to remember those kids weren't kids to me. They were my whole entire reason for getting out of bed at 4 in the morning. I filed for legal guardianship the first year. Got it without much trouble on account of the note and the fact that my daughter had not, in 12 months, responded to a single certified letter. The court gave me temporary guardianship that converted to permanent after she failed to appear at the hearing. The judge was a woman named Honora Pickett, who looked at the file, looked at me, and said, "Sir, I am sorry it has come to this." She signed the order. She gave me a copy. That one went in a safe deposit box, too. 11 years. Now back to that morning. My daughter walked up the porch and stood behind the deputies, and she finally looked at me. Her eyes were dry. She said, "Hi, Dad," like we just bumped into each other at the grocery store. I asked her where she'd been. She said, "We can talk about that later. Right now, I need my children. My children." That's the phrase that broke something in me, not the deputies, not the court order, not the woman from Child Protective Services with her clipboard. My children, like they'd been in a kennel. The oldest was 17 by then. The middle one was 15. The youngest, my baby. The one who still climbed in my lap on Sunday mornings, even though she was almost as tall as me, she was 12. They came down the stairs in their pajamas. My grandson, the oldest, he had his hands balled up at his sides. He looked at his mother like he was looking at a stranger who had broken into the house, which, in a way, she had. The CPS woman knelt down to talk to my youngest. The deputy started reading me something off a piece of paper. I wasn't listening. I was watching my daughter walk toward my grandson with her arms out, and I was watching him take a step back, and I was watching her face change when she realized he wasn't going to hug her. She turned to the deputy. "He's been brainwashed," she said. You see what he did to them? I want to tell you exactly what I felt at that moment, but I don't have the words. I'm a 63-year-old man who worked at a parts counter. I don't have those kinds of words. They took the kids. Not right then, not all at once, but by the end of that week, all three of them had been placed in what the order called interim parental custody, pending adjudication. My daughter had filed an emergency motion claiming I had withheld the children, that her signed note from 11 years before had been forged, that she had been searching for them since 2014. She had a lawyer, a real lawyer, a man in a suit that fit him too well, with a gold pen and a leather portfolio, who introduced himself to me in a courthouse hallway by saying, "Sir, this can all go away quietly if you're willing to be reasonable. His name doesn't matter. I'll get to him. What I want you to understand is that everyone believed her. Not the kids. The kids were a wreck. My grandson refused to speak to her, and they wrote that up as trauma response to prolonged isolation. My middle granddaughter cried so hard at the placement hearing, she threw up in a wastebasket, and they wrote that up as fear of removal from familiar abuser. Me. I was the familiar abuser. My youngest, the 12-year-old. She just kept asking when she could come home. Home, meaning my house. They wrote that one up as Stockholm-adjacent attachment, requires therapy. I sat in that courtroom in a borrowed sport coat that didn't fit at the shoulders, and I listened to a woman I had not seen in over a decade describe me as a man who had stolen her children out of a parking lot in 2014 and refused to give them back. She had photos. She had a private investigator's report. She had a notarized statement from a woman she claimed had been her roommate at the time, who swore she'd watched my daughter try to call me 100 times. I had the note, the original, in the safe deposit box. But here's the part I have to tell you carefully, because it's the part that almost killed me. When I went to the credit union to retrieve it, the box was empty. Not gone, not missing, empty. The bank manager pulled the log. Someone had accessed it the previous Tuesday. Someone with a key and ID and the second signature card on file. The second signature card was my daughter's name. I had added her on the box back when she was in college, 20 years before, because my wife had insisted, just in case anything happens to us. I had never thought about it again. I had never taken her off. She had walked into the credit union, used a driver's license that was still on file with her old name, and emptied the entire box. The note, the guardianship order, my wife's wedding photo, a coin my father had carried in Korea. All of it. I sat in my truck in the credit union parking lot for an hour and a half. I'm not ashamed to tell you I cried, because by that point, I didn't have the energy not to. I cried like I hadn't cried since the day my wife died. Then I drove home and I called the only person left in the world I could call. I'm going to call him my old buddy. Because that's what he was, and because if I say his full name out loud, I'll start crying again. He'd been my neighbor for 31 years. He was a retired long-haul trucker who had buried a wife and a son and lived alone in a single wide on the back lot behind my property. He was 71 years old. He had a beard down to his sternum and a German shepherd that hated everybody but him. When I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Where do you think she put it?" I said I had no idea. He said, "Where would you put it?" I said, "Somewhere I controlled. Somewhere I controlled. Somewhere I'd have access to. Not a bank. Not in her car. She'd been smart enough to come for the box. She'd put it somewhere she could destroy it if she had to." He said, "She got a place in town?" She did. The lawyer had let it slip in one of the hearings. She was staying at a rental on Beach Hollow Road, a short-term lease place she'd taken when she came back into town to file the motion. I didn't have an address, but my buddy had a daughter-in-law who worked for the water department, and within about 90 minutes, we had it. I'm not going to tell you it was legal what we did next. It wasn't. I won't pretend it was. But I'd been a law-abiding man for 63 years, and the law had spent the last 2 months telling me my grandchildren had been stolen by me from a woman who had abandoned them in a Goodwill parking lot a decade before. I was done with the law for the moment. My buddy drove. He had an old Chevy half-ton with no plates on the front bumper and tinted back windows. We parked 4 houses down from the rental at 1:30 in the morning. She wasn't there. She was staying with the lawyer in a hotel in town. We'd figured that much out from her social media, which she had not bothered to make private. We didn't break in. We didn't have to. The back door had a keypad lock with a code that was the last 4 digits of her phone number, because my daughter had always been the kind of person who made things easy for herself, even when she shouldn't. My buddy held a flashlight and I went through every drawer, every cabinet, every closet. It took 2.5 hours. I found it in a shoebox on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, behind a pair of unworn boots, the whole contents of the safe deposit box, tied up with a rubber band, the original note, the guardianship order, the wedding photo, the guardianship order, the wedding photo, the Korean coin. I didn't take anything else. I left the boots where they were. I left her credit card statements and her makeup and her clothes. I took what was mine and we drove away, and we did not turn on the headlights until we were past the stop sign at the end of her street. My buddy dropped me off at 4:15 in the morning. He didn't ask me any questions. He just said, "You go nail her to the wall, brother." Then he drove home with his dog asleep on the bench seat. The next morning, I called the only lawyer in town who'd return my calls. He was a public interest guy named Mr. Ellsworth, 68 years old, semi-retired, who had agreed to take my case for what I could pay him, which wasn't much. I'd been going to him for advice on a sliding scale. When I told him what had happened, that I had the documents again, he said, "Where did you find them?" I said, "In my house. I'd misplaced them." He looked at me for a long second. Then he said, "Mr. Sir, I'm going to ask you that one more time. Where did you find these documents?" I said. "In my house. I'd misplaced them." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "All right. Then that's where you found them." We had 2 weeks until the next custody hearing. In those 2 weeks until the next custody hearing, in those 2 weeks, I did things I had never imagined doing. I drove 3 hours to a town I'd never been to in West Virginia to track down the woman who had supposedly been my daughter's roommate, the one who'd given the notarized statement. Her name and address were on the affidavit. I knocked on her door in the middle of the afternoon. She was a tired-looking woman in her 40s with a toddler on her hip. I told her who I was. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Come in. I need to tell you something." She had not been my daughter's roommate. She had been my daughter's drug counselor at a court-mandated program in 2018. My daughter had paid her $3,000 in cash to sign a statement. The woman had a sick kid, a husband out of work, and a credit card balance she couldn't climb out of. And she had done a terrible thing, and she knew it. She sat at her kitchen table and cried into a paper towel and told me everything. And she let me record it on my phone, and she signed a sworn statement of her own, which I had notarized at a UPS store on the way out of town. I went to the kids' schools, every single one of them going back to elementary. I sat down with teachers, with principals, with the lunch lady who'd been at the elementary school for 31 years and remembered me bringing my granddaughter in for her first day of kindergarten. They all said the same thing. They knew me. They knew the kids. They had never in all those years heard a single word about my daughter. They had records of every parent-teacher conference, every permission slip, every emergency contact form. My name was on all of them. Hers was on none. I went to the pediatrician's office, to the dentist, to the orthodontist who'd put braces on my middle granddaughter when she was 11, to the principal of the high school, to the JV baseball coach, to Miss Ruth Ann at the ballet studio, to every single one of my neighbors on our cul-de-sac. 8 houses, every one of them. I asked them all the same thing. Will you come to court? Will you tell the judge what you know? Every single one of them said yes. Every single one. You want to know what 11 years of being a good neighbor looks like? It looks like 16 people taking time off work to drive to a courthouse on a Tuesday morning to defend a man they all just called Grandpa, whether they were related to him or not. The hearing was on a Tuesday in late October. I wore the same borrowed sport coat. My buddy sat in the back row with his beard combed for the first time in a decade. The kids sat with a court-appointed advocate. My daughter sat at the petitioner's table next to the lawyer in the well-fitting suit. She did not look at me. Mr. Ellsworth went first. He laid out the original note, the guardianship order. The 11 years of school records, medical records, dental records, every report card, every permission slip, every form. He played the recording from the woman in West Virginia. He called the pediatrician, the principal, the ballet teacher. The Brent, the neighbor across the street, a woman in her 70s who held a Kleenex the entire time she testified and at one point at my daughter and said, "I have lived across from that man for 34 years and I had no idea he even had a daughter because she never came to see her own children once." Then he called my grandson, 17 years old, 6 feet tall, in a button-down shirt I'd bought him at a Kohl's the week before. He walked up to that witness stand like he'd been waiting his whole life for it. He testified for 46 minutes. He remembered everything. He remembered the Civic. He remembered the duffel bag. He remembered the macaroni I made him that first night. He remembered being 6 years old and asking me if his mother was coming back. He remembered every birthday I'd thrown him, every game I'd come to, every time I'd sat at the kitchen table helping him with math problems I didn't understand. He remembered the day my middle granddaughter broke her arm and I drove her to the hospital with my youngest on my lap in the front seat because I didn't have anyone to leave her with. He remembered all of it. And when the lawyer in the well-fitting suit tried to cross-examine him, tried to suggest he'd been coached, he looked at that lawyer and he said, "Sir, I am 17 years old. I have a 3.8 GPA. I have been accepted to 2 colleges already. I know the difference between being coached and being raised." The lawyer sat down. My middle granddaughter went next, then my youngest. They each told their stories. They named teachers, doctors, friends, neighbors. They described the rooms in my house. They described rooms in my house. They described meals. My youngest, the 12-year-old, she described the porch swing where I read to her every night until she was 10. She said it like she was reciting a poem. The judge was a man named Judge Holloway. He was about my age, maybe a little older. He listened to all of it with his hands folded on the bench. He took a recess after my youngest got down. When he came back, he asked my daughter to stand up. He said, "Ma'am, do you have any explanation for the documents your father has presented?" She said her lawyer had told her not to answer. The judge looked at the lawyer. He said, "Counselor, were you aware of the falsified affidavit?" The lawyer started to answer. The judge cut him off. He said, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. I am dismissing the petition with prejudice. I am ordering immediate restoration of guardianship to the grandfather. I am further ordering that the petitioner have no contact, direct or indirect, with these children unless and until they, as adults, choose to initiate it themselves." Then he looked at me. He said, "Sir, on behalf of this court, I am sorry. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. I want to tell you what happened after, because for a long time the story was about her, and I'm tired of the story being about her. My daughter was charged with 4 felonies. She took a plea on 2 of them and served 22 months in a state correctional facility." The lawyer in the well-fitting suit was disbarred. "He's selling real estate now, last I heard, in another state. The woman from West Virginia, she got her sentence reduced for cooperating, and the last I heard she had moved her family to Ohio and her husband had found work at a Honda plant. I sent her a Christmas card the first year, and one back came with a school photo of her son taped inside. The kids came home that night. All 3 of them. I made macaroni because that's what I always made when somebody needed something familiar, and we sat at the kitchen table, the 4 of us, and my youngest fell asleep in my lap before she'd finished her plate. My buddy. I have to tell you about my buddy, because there is no version of any of this where I survive without him. 6 months after the hearing, I sold the back 5 acres of my property. I'd been holding on to it for 30 years thinking I'd build something on it. I sold it to a developer for a lot more than I'd ever expected. The first thing I did, before I paid off the second mortgage, before I put money aside for the kids' college, before any of it, I drove to my buddy's single wide and I handed him a cashier's check. It was for $140,000. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "What in the hell is this for?" I said, "It's for the night you didn't ask any questions." He tried to give it back. I wouldn't take it. We argued for about 20 minutes, the way 2 old men argue, which is mostly grumbling and pointing. Finally, he said, "I'll take it if you let me build you a porch." I said, "I already have a porch." He said, "Then let me build the kids a bigger one." So that's what we did. He used about 8,000 of it on lumber. The rest, he put in a CD for his grandniece, who we'd never met but had heard was struggling with medical bills somewhere in Tennessee. He sent her the money anonymously. He never told her it was from him. He told me on the porch he built, drinking a beer at sunset, and then he made me promise not to tell anybody. And now I've told you, but he's gone 3 years now, so I don't suppose he minds. The porch is still there. The kids have signed their names in the wet concrete of the front step, all three of them. My grandson is 25 now and works in software in Charlotte. My middle granddaughter is 22 and teaches second grade. My youngest is finishing her sophomore year at a state school about an hour away, and she comes home most weekends. They call me Grandpa. They've always called me Grandpa. They will always call me Grandpa. I'm 69 years old now. The knee still hurts. I still wake up at 4 in the morning, but now I make coffee and I sit on the porch my buddy built, and I watch the sun come up over the trees behind the house. I think about a lot of things in those hours. I think about my wife and what she would have said about all of it. I think about my daughter sometimes, and I don't know what to feel anymore. The anger has gone soft. It's just sad now. A sad thing that happened to her and to me both a long time ago. But mostly I think about three kids in pajamas coming down a staircase in the dark, 11 years apart on either side of the same morning. Once when she dropped them off, and once when she tried to take them back. I raised them. I fed them. I drove them and I held them and I taught them how to be people. And when the time came, when everything I had was on the line, the only thing I had to do was tell the truth and trust that the people who knew us would do the right thing. They did. Every last one of them. That's the part of the story I want you to remember. Not her, not the lawyer, not the courthouse or the deputies or the cold morning in October. The neighbors, the teachers, the lunch lady, the ballet teacher. My old buddy with his beard and his dog. 16 people who showed up on a Tuesday for a man whose name they barely knew because they knew his grandchildren, and they knew the truth when they saw it. That's the country I still believe in. That's the country I raised those kids to believe in. And that's the end of my story. I've thought a lot in these last few years on the porch about how I ended up surviving something I never thought I'd survive. And the honest answer isn't that I was strong, or smart, or lucky. The honest answer is that I'd spent 11 years quietly planting seeds, and when the storm came, those seeds were already a forest. That's the part that took me a long time to understand. When my daughter walked back up my porch with deputies on either side of her, she thought she was walking into an empty house. She thought a man alone with 3 grandkids, working 2 jobs, 63 years old, was an easy mark. She didn't know about Miss Ruth Ann at the ballet studio. She didn't know about the lunch lady at the elementary school. She didn't know about my old buddy in the single wide out back, or the neighbor across the street who'd been bringing me banana bread every Christmas for 34 years. She didn't know because she hadn't been there. And the things that matter most in a life are built slowly, by being there, day after ordinary day, when nobody's watching. I want my grandkids to understand this, and I want anybody listening to this to understand it too. Character isn't something you put on when trouble shows up. Character is what's already in the room before the trouble walks in. The morning my daughter dropped those babies in my driveway, I had a choice. I could have called the state or driven them to her apartment or done 100 things that would have made my own life easier. I didn't because something in me knew that easier wasn't the same as right. That decision cost me my retirement, my knee surgery, and my wife's wedding ring. It also gave me the only 3 people in this world who call me Grandpa. The other thing I learned, and I'm still learning it, is that the people who try to take from you usually underestimate the things you've quietly held on to. I kept that note. I kept a guardianship order. I kept records nobody told me to keep. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being a steward of the truth because I knew, even back then, that the truth doesn't defend itself. You have to defend it for it. I think about my daughter sometimes and I don't hate her. I used to, but hate is a heavy thing to carry at my age, and I've got grandbabies to lift. What I feel now is sorrow, mostly. That somewhere along the way she chose a road that led her further and further from the people who would have loved her if she'd let them. That's a kind of poverty no amount of money fixes. So if you're listening to this and you're tired and you're raising somebody else's child and you wonder if anybody sees what you're doing, I'm telling you, somebody sees. And one day, when it counts, 16 of those somebodies are going to show up in a courthouse on a Tuesday morning, and they're going to tell the truth for you because you told the truth for them when nobody was watching. That's the only legacy that's ever mattered. That's the only one I wanted.